We begin today, though, with breaking news in what is now set to be the first ever criminal trial of a former president of these United States. It begins in just under 1 month. Prosecutors in Manhattan have asked New York Judge Juan Merchan to impose a gag order on Donald Trump. Sound familiar? Barring him from attacking witnesses, exposing the identities of jurors, or commenting on the prosecutors working on the case. Prosecutors other than District Attorney Alvin Bragg himself. In a flurry of filings submitted this afternoon, prosecutors write this, quote, "The defendant has a long history and continuing pattern of public statements that attack judges, jurors, lawyers, witnesses, and other individuals involved in the legal proceedings against him." The filings are hundreds of pages long. They list a litany of threats made by Donald Trump. And then what happens? The reaction to them. They lay out the call and response pattern between an ex-president who faces 91 felony counts across 4 jurisdictions and his most violent and extreme and motivated backers. Prosecutors say that Trump's attacks, quote, have had direct and serious consequences for his targets. And those harms are multiplied as the defendant's followers take his lead to pursue additional threats, intimidation, and harassment. These facts establish that without the relief requested here, the defendant's unrestrained speech will pose a significant and an imminent threat to the integrity of this proceeding and the fair and orderly adjudication of this case. Now, again, if this is all sounding familiar to you, it does to me. It's because Alvin Bragg is not the first prosecutor to ask for a gag order. Special counsel Jack Smith asked for one in the federal election case. Prosecutors in Manhattan note this, quote, "The U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit recently upheld restrictions on the defendant's extrajudicial speech that are essentially identical to the ones requested by the people here." In the New York civil fraud trial, Judge Arthur Engoron ordered Donald Trump to refrain from attacking court staff. That was in the blockbuster civil fraud trial late last year. The Manhattan DA also revealed what happened when their case against Trump started to pick up steam last year, resulting in an indictment back in May, writing this, quote, "In 2022, NYPD's Threat Assessment and Protection Unit, that's TAPU, logged 483 threat cases against public officials, only one of which involved threats to the DA, his family, or employees of this office. In 2023, the same office, TAPU, logged 577 threat cases, 89 of which involved threats to the district attorney, his family, or employees of this office." Manhattan prosecutors, the latest to be grappling with the disgraced ex-president as a clear and present danger to the rule of law, is where we begin today with some of our most favorite reporters and friends. All of them to help prop me up today on this first day back. At the table, MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin joins us, former U.S. Senator, co-host of MSNBC's How to Win 2024 podcast. Claire is here, Claire McCaskill, and former top prosecutor at the Department of Justice, Andrew Weissman, joins us. Lisa, I know you had the job of reading the whole thing before you ran to TV. Tell me what it says.
You know, Nicole, this is a 331-page filing, so I'd love to be able to tell you that I've read the whole thing. But one of the things I think is so interesting about this is how well the DA's office goes through Donald Trump's history, including some parts of it that I had forgotten, namely the threats against the jury foreperson in the Roger Stone case, going all the way through the threats to this DA's office. And one of the things they say is until March of 2023, the guy who's the head of Alvin Bragg's security detail said he had never been aware of the Threat Assessment Protective Unit getting information about threats to people who were line prosecutors, meaning this was the first time he'd experienced threats to someone other than the elected district attorney. But the history here, the litany of social media posts, criminal cases against people who have threatened public officials, including Fani Willis and Mr. Bragg himself, the threats against Jack Smith, the threats against Judge Engoron's wife and his law clerk. Together, they present a picture of a person who, when unleashed, really has the potential to corrupt these judicial proceedings. And in this particular circumstance, has a statutory right to know the names of jurors, which differentiates this case from the federal cases we've seen before, where, for example, in both E. Jean Carroll cases, the jury was fully anonymized. That's not going to be the case here, making it all the more necessary that, unlike the gag order entered by Judge Chutkan, there's a need for a third provision protecting jurors.
It's just surreal. I mean, I was nervous that none of the stories would be familiar to me, but, 17, 18 is calling, and it wants its threats to the rule of law back. Donald Trump has been doing this since the Mueller team was investigating his campaign back then.
Absolutely. And to channel you, you're like, these are not new stories, they're new circumstances. One sort of big picture comment, aside from the fact that you have somebody who used to be the head of the executive branch, where there have now been multiple courts, as Lisa pointed out, that have had to take this precaution with respect to somebody who was the president of the United States, is a lot of people correctly want to see legal accountability, whatever it is, whether there's a conviction or not, they want to see legal accountability. But in terms of the political realm, in terms of what you and Claire focus on a lot, Donald Trump is telling us who he is now through what he is doing. Just the fact that judges have had to do this repeatedly in civil cases, in criminal cases, in federal cases, in state cases, tells you who it is who is saying that he is fit to be in office. I sort of feel like that message is getting lost because people keep on thinking of this as an interim thing that needs to be overcome to get to legal accountability.
I don't think it's I mean, look, I think this has always been an undue burden on the rule of law and the justice system. The political process failed. I mean, and he's now, I've missed a lot of news, but I know he's roaring to the Republican nomination. That we used to have politics that, I mean, it's why Jim Traficant didn't become a presidential nominee in his party, right? We now have the Jim Traficant of the Republican Party as the obvious nominee. I mean, the problem and the strain on the rule of law is because the politics didn't catch him in their net. And I guess my question then is back over to the rule of law. Can it handle him?
So I think the answer is yes. I do think, I mean, just take a look at Judge Kaplan, the federal judge over the E. Jean Carroll case. That is sort of a wonderful model. It is true he had certain tools available to him, as Lisa said, that are not going to be available in the first instance in the state level. But he ran an incredibly tight ship. He saw who he had there. He's extremely experienced. He protected the jury. He protected witnesses. He gave a jury instruction that he doesn't usually give, talking about the role of the jury that is fundamental to our nation. I mean, it was so moving, and he clearly was trying to counteract the explicit calls to jury nullification that were made by Donald Trump's counsel, explicit calls to ignore what this guy is telling you. Ignore what the plaintiff wants. Just take the law into your own hand. And it was clear the judge was worried about that. So I do think the legal system can handle it. Obviously, as we have talked about, there is a belated issue in terms of the time crunch that we are under now. But we are where we are. But I do think that Judge Merchan and Judge Chutkan, if she ever gets the green light, are precisely the kind of no-nonsense, even-keeled judges who can handle this. I should just note, with respect to Judge Cannon in Florida, whether she ever even takes her case to trial, but she has before her an issue that is directly relevant to what we're talking about. She said that the names of witnesses and their statements should be made public. And the government has gone back to her to say, you need to reconsider that. And she is going to take that under advisement. But that is precise to see whether she also will adhere to what all these other judges have understood as necessary to the rule of law, which is protecting a trial, protecting witnesses. And it'll be interesting to see whether she follows suit. But that's one where, if she does not, I think there's no question that the government will appeal that.
So in 2015 and 16, we had to use our imagination to try to conjure up what sort of threats jurors could face, but we don't anymore, right? Rusty Bowers, billboards, electronic billboards, calling him a pedophile outside of his house. You've got all of the people that testified for the January 6th committee, most of them Republicans who were targeted by Trump and his followers with threats of death. Fani Willis was doxxed. The information is housed on a Russian-hosted. I mean, lives changed forever. The security robbed of not just the public officials, but their children, their spouses, their ex-spouses, their parents, forever. That's what we're talking about for jurors.
Yeah. So two things. First, I think it's really important to remember, for everybody to remember, that what these courts are doing vis-a-vis Donald Trump and his statements is just how anybody else would be treated. This is not allowed in criminal or civil cases. Parties to the case are not allowed to go out. I mean, if I was the prosecutor on a case and the defendant was out there doing this, first of all, his lawyers would stop him, or her lawyers would stop him, because of the offense to the protocol of the court. Nobody would get away with this. Now, that's one point. Now, you want to hear the really bad news? It's working for him.
How?
Well, because if you look at the polling, Nicole, once he got indicted...
no jury has acquitted him of anything.
I agree, but since he got indicted, his numbers have only solidified. If you talk to people who are talking about supporting Trump, they say, well, they're going after him. If this gag order is entered, can you imagine the response at these rallies he has when he says, well, they've gagged me? Well, of course they've gagged you. The government is after you. The swamp is silencing you. They're weaponizing the Justice Department to go after you unfairly. It plays into his campaign strategy that he is a victim and he is the cheerleader of grievance. By the way, along the way, he's going to remind them how America's in the trash because of all this is happening to him.